Welcome to Keith and I Don't Tread on Anyone in the Libertarian Institute. Today I'm joined by Dr. Chris Coyne to discuss his book, How to Run Wars, a confidential playbook for the national security elite. Dr. Coyne, where is the best place for people to check out this book?
Amazon.com is the most convenient place to check out the book if people are interested. It's hard copy, e-copy, ebook, and will soon be audiobook as well. So there's different options to consume it.
I had so much fun reading this book. I'm curious, how could you categorize this genre? Is it like satire?
Yeah, that's exactly how I would categorize it. So it's a satirical work, and one of the things that we've run into is some people don't read past the first chapter or two and think that we're actually laying out an actual guide for carrying out war, and miss the point. And the fun part of satire is that it's a blast to write in that style. And of course, the purpose of that style is to kind of ask the reader to hold up a mirror to reveal many of the absurdities and tensions of well-established and well accepted practices. The downside is with foreign intervention is that it almost writes itself, and so it's quite easy to read it as being serious because it's actually how many interventionists and how governments act in the world.
Absolutely. I loved the book. I got a ton of stuff for us to go over. You open up saying that the US faces threats from China, Iran, Russia, and North Korea. Notice that all of the sources you use say that there is a threat out there that we have to address, or else, we might be vulnerable to attack. However, when it comes to the hindsight of so many wars, it seems like, well, it's less about a threat and more about bringing democracy to Afghanistan and taking out the Taliban, bringing democracy to Iraq, liberating the Jews of Eastern Europe, really stopping Kaiser Wilhelm from trampling all over Europe. So, in hindsight, they have a totally different way of selling these wars than they do in the present. Is there anything you see when it comes to the difference between how wars are framed historically versus how they're initially sold?
Well, certainly they vary from case to case, but also think there's some common themes. There is a warning of some grave threat. That threat is typically then supposedly met or solved, or at least our political overseers tell us, by giving them more power, by intervening abroad. And again, there's variation. Even the current day, there's variation between Libya and Afghanistan and Ukraine. They're not all the same. But the general thrust is, which is there's threats all around the world that threaten liberty and security in the United States. It is the US government's job to police the world and solve these problems. When you start thinking in those terms, it's quite nice if you are a proponent of war making, because you can justify anything and everything on those grounds. Because, of course, threats are an omnipresent part of life. But of course, how you deal with threats is an object of choice. And the incentive of the US government, and other governments as well, I should say, is to engage in what's called threat inflation, to continually overstate both the existence of threats and the magnitude of threats. Because for the ill-informed, in terms of the citizenry, it's a quite nice way to justify your existence and the ever expanding portfolio of activities that are undertaken by the national security state.
I was looking into some research on how abusive spouses justify their behavior. And literally, in all the interviews, zero of them said, well, I'm a manipulative narcissist, and that's why I do it. They were all keeping either their spouse safe or keeping their family intact. It was always done under the same guise of protecting the very people that they're reading into the text messages of with their spouse, when they're saying, well, I basically had a curfew for my spouse, but it was all in their interest, etc. We always get this. Is there any way to differentiate between genuine threats that we have to protect against and what might be inflated threats as to something we shouldn't really worry about? Do you have a general metric we can use to determine real threats from fake ones?
Sure. Well, I don't think there is a general metric. And the reason why is I think a large part of threats is subjective. meaning that whether you or I as an individual feel threatened is partially dependent on us, partially dependent on our circumstances, partially dependent on others. And just think about. I always start from the perspective of the individual, ordinary individuals, and of course, most people when they talk about these issues invert that. They start from the perspective of the nation state, but I always start from the ordinary individual. And if we just think about our own lives, in some settings, we leave our front door unlocked and open, and we don't worry about people coming in. In other areas of our life, the same person, we might lock the front door if we're in the middle of Washington, D.C., for instance, because there's lots of threats in Washington, D.C. The same person, different circumstances, might feel the threat differently. The reason that's important is because when it comes to matters of national security, the ordinary individual is typically removed from the equation entirely. That is, things are done in our name, but they are done by a very small group of elites, what we in the book call the national security elites, and that refers broadly to the kind of interplay or entanglements between the public sector and private sector who are involved in national security, broadly understood. And they are granted an enormous amount of discretionary decision making and power to combat threats. And of course, they're going to impose their valuations on things. And so then you just start thinking about basic incentives. And the incentive is for them to threat inflate, to control us, but also to justify their existence. And so one way to think about this is in terms of malfeasance. So once you grant people significant power over other people, what type of people are you going to attract? This was the point I took you to be making earlier about narcissism, among other characteristics of people that are quite comfortable imposing their views on others. But even if you take a more kind of benevolent set of assumptions and you say, all right, these people are actually good-spirited people in the national security state, which might be a heroic assumption, but perhaps as a thought experiment, we might adopt it. They still have an incentive to threat inflate, because that is how they justify the existence of massive bureaucracies and trillions of dollars being spent on their activities, is to say there's something genuine out there that needs to be addressed. And then look, hey, we addressed it. But also there's all these other threats as well we need to address. And so it's a never ending cycle. And so one way we might think about whether there's genuine threats is to think about where the decision-making node lies and whether it is people that are actually being threatened to have a say in the decision. That's like the locking your door or arming yourself, versus other people making the decision on your behalf. And when other people are making the decision on your behalf, I'm quite skeptical that they have a incentive to do so in a manner that is in the best interest of the people they purport to represent, especially as you move further and further away from them, which of course the national security state is as far removed from ordinary citizens as one can be.
Page 17, you say, you must control the narrative. For any war or intervention to be successful, you must have the support of the broader populace. Now, this is in, I guess, opposition to the idea that the elites do whatever they want, whether everyone loves it or everyone hates it. They have the power and they just go through with things that people either love or hate. Why is it that you're convinced that popular or public opinion matters when it comes to decisions that elites make?
So my own view of this is it's a mix, actually. So it's not an either or. And here's what I mean by that, to say a little bit more in concrete terms and to add some meat to the bones of that broad statement. Any government, that goes for the American government, authoritarian governments, democratic governments, whatever form, require enough support from enough of the populace to maintain their position of power. And that simply means if enough people revolted against government, removed their support, there's no way government could push back, or it could, but it couldn't survive, which of course is why governments invest so much in terms of convincing the citizenry that they're needed. So that, I think, is the fundamental nature of the relationship between the populace and government, irrespective of the type of government. That's what Abby, my co-author Abby Hall, and I mean when we say that you need to convince and maintain support of enough of the populace in a broad sense that you're necessary. But then when you do that, once you've done that, the national security elite in the United States and elsewhere, I should say, but certainly the United States, have an enormous scope for discretionary decision making. It is near impossible for ordinary citizens to track, follow, and understand what people are doing in their name, even if they wanted to, even if they were the most concerned citizen, because it's such a convoluted bureaucracy. There is so much secrecy that it's nearly impossible to do. Even for people like who are focused as investigative journalists, it's extremely difficult to do. And so I think it's a mix. On the one hand, broad support is necessary. If enough of the populace doesn't believe that the government is necessary for them to live free and secure lives, then that's going to cause significant problems for the government in terms of its ability to function and exist and do things. But once people, the citizenry, are broadly convinced that government is necessary and sufficient for their freedom, liberty, and well being, then you are granting government an enormous scope to do what they want. And so that's how I see that fitting together in my model of the world.
So you have the view that Mises has, where both President Biden and Kim Jong Un have the power they do as a result of general public opinion. As that goes for every king, queen, and pharaoh in the past as well. That's
Yes.
your
Yes.
general idea.
I think all political authority is ultimately dependent on the underlings, if you will, the people that are below the political rulers, subscribing to that power and buying into it, whatever the source of that is. And I think empirically that plays out. If you look at governments throughout history and of all sorts, what do they try to do? Well, in the present, they are continually trying to convince, influence, and reinforce the view among the populace that they are where it's at, that they are the source of order, they're the source of freedom, and so on. And of course, governments historically have engaged in brutal force in order to control messaging, to control information, to engage in propaganda, and so on. And one of the best things government does from their perspective, which again happens both in democratic systems and authoritarian systems, is to turn the citizenry into their part, an arm of their surveillance state. That is, they have them monitoring their fellow citizens. They have them turning against their fellow citizens who deviate from the narrative. And so you see this in the United States oftentimes when people are deemed to be unpatriotic. They are deemed to be anti-American, anti-military, or more recently, if you question the U.S. efforts abroad, whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's in Israel, then you're a Putin sympathizer or a Putin lover. You're an anti-Semite, and so on. And perhaps some of those people that are skeptical of those war efforts. But to my way of thinking, being a good patriot, being a good citizen, is being skeptical of those things as your default position, not because you are pro some other government, but because you have a good understanding of how your own government operates and how that can undermine the very thing that the government purports to protect and uphold.
Anyone who disagrees with this kind of has to explain why governments explicitly propagandize so much. They already have the power. Why do they have to focus on, the military parades and all the suits and all the meetings and all the buildings? And in DC, no building can be higher than the Capitol building and all this stuff. You have to explain why they go through all this effort if public opinion just doesn't matter, that they have all the control. I was trying to think of examples where we have, um, let's see, right here. So, when it comes to examples of public opinion actually changing reality of things, there was a big protest among members of the military. This is from Business Insider in September of 2013. They have a collection of what appear to be soldiers who write things on paper in their uniform, saying things like, "I didn't join the Marine Corps to fight for Al Qaeda in a Syrian civil war. Obama, I will not deploy to fight for your Al Qaeda rebels in Syria. Wake up, people." And the list goes on. So, when it comes to actual examples that we see where there was a great deal of public outcry and the government responded by either doing something in accordance with their demands or stop doing something. What are some empirical examples that come to mind that really show us that when public opinion is leaning a certain way, the elites will follow?
Yeah. Well, one of them, of course, might be you might look at Vietnam and the response to Vietnam, which, of course, was the multifaceted in terms of the influences. So I don't want to make it's very hard to identify a single causal relationship between popular outcry and responses. But certainly, the public backlash put an enormous amount of pressure on the U.S. government. The revelation of various, again, what were considered top secret documents that the U.S. government was lying to the people led to part of that backlash. And so that might be one example right there. And again, it's hard because even if you look, for instance, at things like Iraq and Afghanistan, public opinion varied greatly in the United States. So right after 9/11, public opinion in support of George W. Bush and U.S. war efforts was sky high. It was extremely high.
91%
Yes,
approval rating George Bush had.
that's right.
After his whole job is keep you safe. He doesn't keep you safe in a huge way, and his approval goes to 91%.
That's right.
Does anyone in the private sector ever face this
Yeah,
biggest failure in the company's history, and then their profits triple or something?
it's
It's a
crazy.
little
Not
ridiculous.
without a government bailout, they don't, but perhaps under that scenario.
Yeah.
Um, but the public opinion ebbed and flowed during the decades in Iraq and Afghanistan, and even there, when there was public pressure, and it wasn't extreme, meaning that interestingly, if you look in America after the Bush administration, so with Obama, the left wing anti war movement didn't entirely dissipate, but it did lose a significant amount of its steam. And of course, Obama ran on this whole platform of being a non-interventionist, Nobel Peace Prize, all this, which of course couldn't have been further from the truth based on actions. But a lot of that anti-war movement kind of dissipated. But even there, even when public opinion turned against those war efforts, certainly it didn't remain at 91% approval rating for the presidency post 9/11 for Bush or Obama. It took a long time to get out of these places, and part of my own skepticism of intervention, and there's many margins of that skepticism, is like any government program. Once you get into something, it's extremely difficult to get out. And even when you get out, you're still involved. You're still entangled in that mess that you've created to a large extent. You here being the United States government, and so public opinion certainly is a powerful thing, but it's not an end all be all. And to my way of thinking, part of the reason Abby and I wrote this book is to hopefully convince people that they should have skepticism of foreign intervention on the front end. So don't wait till you get into the thing and then say, well, maybe I should start questioning it. And that might be a second best or a third best situation. But the ideal would be on the front end to step back and say, what are we doing here? And should we be doing this at all? And to my way of thinking, there's not enough of that among the American citizenry. And I'm hoping this book and the style it's written will open people's eyes to that.
One example that came to mind while I was reading the book of public opinion pushback changing the way the elites operate is the DGB. What was the Disinformation Governance Board?
Yeah, great example. The disinformation board was a agency or a group within an agency, I should say, that was set up under the Biden administration to combat disinformation. And you have to remember, of course, and this has been part and parcel of the U.S. government basically since its founding, but certainly during wartime and other public crises, has been controlling information. And so it's not a new phenomena by any means. One interesting thing I was thinking about when we were just talking about the prior topic, during the world wars, the U.S. government didn't even really try to hide any of this. They created the Committee on Public Information, for instance, whose very purpose was to disseminate war propaganda. And there wasn't even an effort to conceal it. Of course, now perhaps they've wisened up. I'm guessing because it wouldn't be as tolerable among the public to say we're going to actively propagandize you. So they do much of it behind the scenes. And of course, during COVID and all that was involved in that, the US government attempted to control the flow of information through various social media platforms and so on. And so, what this group tried to do under the Biden administration, what the purpose of it was to uh, control information. The idea, of course, was that if the marketplace of information is left to its own devices, that is, if you and I and other private individuals are allowed to have our own way, then you're going to get the spread of lies, disinformation, fake news, all this kind of whatever the verbiage, the rhetoric of the day is, or week, changes constantly, and that the government needs to correct that. The government needs to oversee information, to block bad information, to promote good information, and that's what this group was supposed to do. And of course, as you pointed out, it eventually went by the wayside. It was thrown in the trash bin, largely because of public pushback. And so, and interestingly, social media, which spread what was going to happen, or what could happen, and what was going on, and led to public backlash. And of course, the people involved said, well, this is, even as it was happening, they were saying this is a grand kind of conspiracy theory. This is right wing nonsense kind of thing. The government would never misuse and abuse this power. Again, with no appreciation or recognition of the historical record, which has multiple cases of outright abuse and distortions of information. So these aren't accidents like, oops, sorry, I forgot to mention that. These are explicit efforts to conceal information and to promote incorrect information to get the public on their side. But, even with that, you have public opinion pushing back against this one initiative. But if you look at surveys among the American public about things like surveillance, things like government having access to our information in the name of security, I don't know the most recent numbers, but they're certainly not strongly against. So it's not 90% against. Many Americans take the view, unfortunately, in my opinion, that as the common saying going, I have nothing to hide, so it's okay for them to be able to monitor and surveil me, and that's highly problematic. But also means that people like yourself and myself needs to continually kind of raise the alarm to alert people to what that means.
Of course, I remember Brian Kaplan said that he started writing The Myth of the Rational Voter to find out, why policies are so bad. Then he found out what the average person actually believes, and he goes, "Policies are a heck of a lot better than what the average person would actually want." So definitely in the business of changing public opinion. On page 22, you address the noble deception. Quote, there are things that government needs to do for the benefit of the public. The average citizen simply cannot or should not know, both for their own good and for the good of the country. So, what might come to mind is, what if everyone knew how to make nuclear weapons? What if everyone knew how to create the AIDS virus or could manufacture COVID 20? Do you think there's anything to this theory that needs to be addressed, that sometimes there are truths that the student can handle, truths that an adult can handle, and truths that the smart adult can handle? This is an actual quote you use from Irving Kristol in
That's right.
the book. Any credence to this theory, or is it just a bunch of psychos trying to control us?
Well, certainly, I think in life we all frame and communicate information to each other, meaning other human beings, in different ways, and those of us that are considered socially aware certainly take into account context. And what do I mean by that? When we interact with kids, we frame information a certain way because they are children, and we're their parents. And so from that standpoint, it makes sense to do. When we interact socially with people, if I don't like the shirt someone's wearing, it's considered good social form not to simply blurt out that your shirt is ugly. So from that standpoint, all of us refrain from having a fully unfiltered kind of way we interact with people, and we filter information. But now again, let's move from that starting point, us as individuals interacting, to the relationship with government. And here's why I don't think it translates meaning I don't think there are, I don't want to say never, but I think you'd be hard pressed to identify a situation that I would find convincing where that holds in the relationship between the citizens and the government. And the reason why is because the citizens in a free society are supposed to be the adults. So the relationship in a free society, and I'm not saying the world works like this, but this is the way it's supposed to work in a democratic setup, is political power is driven from the bottom up. So it is the citizenry that have the power, and those that are in government are representative of the people. So there's a reason we call them public or civil servants. They're not supposed to run the show. The citizenry is. And so when you take on the position that there's these really smart elites up here, and then there's people down here that are goofy or stupid, then that inverts the relationship. The very setup is that power needs to come from top down, because the minute you introduce that, nothing's off limits. The U.S. government elite knows what's best for you and I when it comes to war because they're the experts. All right. Well, they're also the experts on public health. They're the experts on nutrition. They're the experts on education. I could go on. Going back to what we just talked about, they're the experts on what information is good and bad and right and wrong. And before you know it, that same logic can be used to justify anything. And so the point that there's not many instances where I think there's the smart adults and the silly adults isn't to point out that there's not silly people in the world. It's not to point out that expertise is not important. I think expertise is quite important in the world. What I am skeptical of is that there are sufficient mechanisms in politics to filter out the silly people. And so we always have to keep in mind there is we need to have a symmetry of assumptions to be analytically consistent. And what that means is if we're going to assume there's silly people over here in the citizenry, we can't magically assume that only the enlightened people are in government. Who runs government? The people. It's selected from the population of the people. So then you have to be able to make an argument, you being the proponent of government elite keeping secrets and running things, that only the high quality people are going to be selected into the positions of power and act in that manner once they're in those positions.
As far as who ends up in government, the sort of selection process that leads to a Anthony Blinken, to an Anthony Fauci, to a George W. Bush or Dick Cheney, these are not, I don't think these are the average people who just get power and then totally change. I think there is a bit of a selection process. Do you think it's very likely that the worst people in some sort of system like this tend to rise to the top, not because they have a lot of power, but they have a lot of power that people can't opt out of engaging with?
I certainly think that's the tendency. And again, you don't need to assume malfeasance on the front end. So you don't even have to assume that there are kind of it's some conspiracy theory that certain people are going to rise to the top, even though there might be that. Just think about the selection mechanisms as you put it. So first of all, what is required for the job? That's step one. Well, you need to be willing to impose your views upon people. You need to believe that you have the power to control the nation and the world. So imagine you're in one of these top national security positions in the United States. You would have to buy into the idea that the United States government is the source of the world's order. So imagine the confidence, you might call it, if you're being charitable, the absolute arrogance, if you're being less charitable, but perhaps more accurate, that you need to have to think that you can bring order to the world, that you have the knowledge, the right, and so on to do this. Then you have to believe that government, this enormous entity that is ultimately an entity of force, is the tool to do it. And so you have to have the arrogance to think you can do it. And you have to have the confidence that top-down control through a massive force-based apparatus is the appropriate way to interact with other human beings. So that's the front end. So think about that for a moment. People who don't think in those terms won't be happy applying for the position in the first place because they won't opt into those positions. So what you're left with are people that are like, okay, I'm interested in that. I can buy into those things. Then they work their way through the system. So they get into the system, then they have to rise. Well, how do you rise? Through the system. What you and I were talking about earlier. They have to do stuff. They have to justify their existence. The way bureaucracies operate is by producing observable outputs, by, as we started our conversation, saying, look, there's all these threats around the world, which is why Abby and I start the book in those terms, saying, look, there's threats everywhere in the world that you, the national security, need to address. Without you, we can't have safety. That's the mindset you have to have. And so once you work your way up, you're going to keep filtering out each step of the way people that are opposed to that way of thinking. And then what you're left with is kind of the best of the best, but not the best of the best in terms of how we would think about it in a market, for instance, in terms of the people that are best able to satisfy the wants of consumers through positive sum interactions, the best of the best in terms of leveraging and deploying the tools of force and social control associated with government in a way that is effective, not in terms of spreading liberty and democracy and freedom and all the other kind of grandiose ends that are promised, but in terms of using force. They're going to be the best of the best. Elsewhere, Abby and I have called them specialists in state force. That's who you're going to be left with. That's just a comparative advantage argument. It's an economic argument in terms of economics says that when you have different positions and skills, and there's going to be a tendency for people that are good at things to self-select into those things. And
I
so it's
think
no different with the state.
Yeah, I think it was Hayek in The Road to Serfdom who makes the case that why the worst rise to the top. And even if you don't believe any of what you just said, which you've made a terrific case for it, your colleague Robin Hanson, I think, would make the case that even if a random person were given that much unchecked authority to initiate aggression without facing repercussions, they would first do it to increase their social status and then rationalize the unjust things as best they could. He refers to this as the elephant in the brain. So, uh, any way you look at this, I think the libertarian position is so vitally important through and through. On page 34, you say, repetition and reputation will typically make the message true in the minds of the public. What evidence or reasoning do you have that something like repetition actually changes whether people see something as true or false?
Yeah. So a lot of this just comes down to framing in general. So if people are turning on news, for instance, to learn about the world or whatever their source of news is, as you hear a message, you take that into account. But as you hear that message repeated, especially by different sources that are viewed as credible, then you start to view it as more credible. And this isn't a robotic response. So it's not like anyone can just say stuff and all of a sudden you just buy into it. But when it comes to matters where you view the sources as legitimate, and one of the things we talk about in the book is how the US government does such a wonderful job indoctrinating people from a young age that they are the source of order and that they are necessary in order to protect the people. So there's already that source of legitimacy, that baseline legitimacy there. And then it's just a matter of finding different credible sources to broadcast that message to people. And so one of the examples we talk about in the book relates to the George W. Bush administration. And, one of the things they did is they would partner with experts. And I use that term loosely here, but these were all people who were former military, part of the military industrial complex. They would basically feed them talking points. They would go on cable news, talk about how great the war on terror was going, how it was a success. And then, of course, members of the Bush administration would later cite these experts as saying, see, the experts say we're doing great. And it was this just cycle of reinforcement and repetition, which certainly worked for a period of time. And for the non-discerning consumer, the ordinary citizen, and even for perhaps the discerning citizen, it is extremely hard to disentangle this because these connections are not revealed. And you can easily see how having a former member of the military or some high-ranking official or bureaucrat on TV gives a sense of credibility. But of course, that credibility is grounded in the fact that people buy into the narrative that the U.S. government's national security state is where it's at when it comes to the source of order and security in the first place.
Yeah, I think I forget Lloyd Austin's position, but he was like on the board of Raytheon previously. Hank Paulson was like the chief executive officer of Goldman Sachs before he was calling shots at the Treasury, I believe. So these people, it's just as ridiculous as saying we could only understand religion by citing theologians. They're the experts in the field. Richard Dawkins, shut up. Sam Harris, never talk about it. You're not a theologian. You're not an expert. It's like, well, those might be the very worst people, as well as the site, the source to cite. You have a great explanation of lying by omission. Page 39, you say the soda straw effect, the ability to see only a very limited portion of a larger and more complex set of issues. What is the soda straw effect? Can you give me an empirical example that people might be familiar with when it comes to the soda straw effect or lying by omission?
Sure. The idea is that you filter information. So it's not that you're completely concealing all information, but you're only giving access to a small slice. So the soda straw is supposed to represent a very narrow stream or slice of information, because it prevents the person observing the information and communicating it to others from presenting the broader picture. And so, what Abby and I talk about in the book, if I remember in this portion, is the idea of embeddedness. And so one of the things the U.S. government did during the war on terror and the foreign interventions that were involved is they would embed reporters. And so, embeddedness, for those who are unfamiliar, is when you send over reporters are sent abroad to a area where a conflict is taking place, and they're embedded with troops. On the face of it, which is the purpose, this sounds wonderful. It's like they are going to get a front seat view of the war. They'll be able to report back. They'll give us the on the ground perspective. And really, they don't. And this, the evidence which we cite in the book and talk about in the book comes from many journalists themselves. We have other sources as well, but even journalists point out the problems with this, which is they are embedded in oftentimes with a group of soldiers who are doing things which are not representing the worst of the war effort, the most extreme of the war effort. And so they only see certain portions of what is going on. Oftentimes it's quite sanitized in terms of what they're seeing. But then on top of that, it's troubling and difficult for reporters to give an accurate assessment. On the one hand, they're only seeing what they're seeing in that group. So they're not seeing the whole overarching war effort and all the things that are entailed in it. But second of all, they are also become, and again, this comes from journalists themselves, our natural tendency is to be quite sympathetic to those that are our companions. And so journalists have reported that their tendency is not to be overly critical of the troops that they're embedded with. Certainly not on live telecasts or recorded telecasts while they're embedded, because they're dependent on these people for access to information. And in the case that they are put in harm's way, for protection. So they have an incentive to be biased in the direction of reporting positive news. And so that's just one example of a very streamlined set of information and news. And this, again, journalists have recognized this. Famous journalists, Walter Cronkite years ago pointed out that during wartime, it is extremely difficult, or especially difficult. It's always difficult, he says, but it's even more difficult during war to be an objective journalist, because he says, after all, it's our country at war. We care about the troops. We don't want them to be harmed. We want the American public to support the war effort and to support the troops. And so even the most famous of journalists have recognized that there's a natural tendency for the media to become a additional arm, if you will, of the national security apparatus in general, but certainly during times of on the ground conflict.
Page 59, you say, always be sure to emphasize that service and self sacrifice of the individual for the greater good. Why is it that they push collectivism necessarily? Because I could see making like a libertarian case for collectivism, like stop being so selfish. You need to think about others. You can't just go around initiating violence for your own selfish interests. You have to think about other people, and that's why the non-aggression principle is important. Is there a reason that they use collectivism when you could really see it being used as every argument against them?
Yeah, I don't know if it's purposeful that they use it. Perhaps it is. I think the perhaps explanation I would give is something like this: state war making is a collectivist enterprise through and through. And here's what I mean by that: the state at the national level. So, with taking nation states as given, we're talking the highest level of government within a set of borders is the entity that carries out, designs, and implements war making. Everyone has to fall in line. So again, you either fall in line voluntarily, or you're controlled, or you're just indifferent. You're like, oh, that's what the government does, so I'm not gonna, I have my own life to live. But people fall in line. Not every single person, but enough people. This goes back to what we were talking about before with public support. And then what happens is the entire enterprise becomes framed in terms of the nation. And then that is, by the way, soldiers and killing human beings. That is economic activity. You saw this most explicitly during the two world wars, when parts of the US economy were actually nationalized, again in the name of the greater good. So it was certainly not a capitalist system anymore. If it was, even at the time, it was much closer to a fascist economic system, corporatism. And so through and through, it's collectivism of a very, what I would call, vulgar kind. Meaning that when I say vulgar here, it's very blunt, and it involves killing people. Just think about war making the way it's set up. It is the U.S. versus Russia, the U.S. versus China. So the millions upon millions of actual human beings, living, breathing people with their own lives, their own purposes and plans and families and loved ones, goes by the wayside. It's us versus them in the most collectivist of terms. And so that's why I think the language naturally falls out of it like that. I don't even know if it's purposeful. I'm sure in some instances it is, but just the way people talk about it is at odds with individualism at its core. And as to your point about, being selfish, I think my own view is there's a difference between, being selfish with your peanut butter and jelly sandwich when someone's hungry, and you give them half your peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and deploying the tools of violence and war against other people. Again, the idea that we come together to fight them means we're going to engage in violence against them. War making at its core entails normalizing what under any other scenario of life would be the most repugnant criminal behavior. Arson, robbery, murder, maiming people. We don't justify this logic in daily life as being a normal way of interacting with other human beings. But war making allows people to normalize it, as you put it earlier, to rationalize it, to say, like, yes, we realize this is repugnant, but this is special. The idea of war is hell. What do you expect to happen? Bad things are going to happen. And so that's why I think that kind of framing gets adopted. Part of it's just a natural outcome. Part of it, of course, is, they need support. And so how do you get people on board? Well, one of the ways you get people on board is you make them part of a collective, and you make it clear to them that deviating from the collective is going to lead to some kind of punishment, whether it's fines, imprisonment, murder, social ostracism, or what have you. But there's some significant cost from deviating from the group.
It's amazing, this contradiction. You see it everywhere, where you'll hear most politicians, whether it's Joe Biden, Lindsey Graham, Seth Moulton, they'll say things like, if you disagree with the U.S. government, you got to try to achieve your ends peacefully through deliberative democracy, or else Sorry, you're just out of luck. You got to take other people into consideration. But if any foreign government potentially violates your freedom, don't ever engage in appeasement. That's what Neville Chamberlain did. Only a coward would do it. Risk mass death, mass theft, and mass murder so your potential freedoms are not violated. Now, April 15th is coming up soon, so make sure to send us 30% of your income or we'll cage you and have the police shoot you if you try resisting. I mean, this blatant appeasement contradiction that all of the Democrats and all of the Republicans believe is so extremely shallow for the costs that they're willing to bear to fight these wars. I mean, I'm supposed to believe it's that important whether Viktor Yanukovych is on the throne in Kiev or whether it's Vladimir Zelensky, because that's basically what the war is over. Either someone who answers to Putin or someone who answers to NATO. That's why, according to the estimates I've heard, it's literally about 100,000 Ukrainians have died, not to mention all the property destruction, not to mention all the enslavement of all the conscripts in Ukraine and the conscripts in Russia, not defending Putin by any metric here. So, yes, all of this info is so good. People would never justify anyone else doing this, but with all the propaganda that you guys do such a great job exposing in this book is really helpful. One of the examples, page 64, even if your policies are ultimately ineffective, they are important to implement to produce observable indicators that you are doing something to protect the public from global threats. As far as the doing something fallacy goes, can you give us an empirical example of that?
Well, sure. I mean, I don't know where to start. I mean, there's so many there's so many examples. I mean, look, going back to what you just said about appeasement, the very idea of the existence of a permanent war economy, a permanent forward deployed set of forces, if you will, because the United States government has hundreds of bases around the world and military installations. These are all examples of they're self-fulfilling prophecies in some sense, because you say we need to prepare for war because there's war. Then you go abroad and there's war. And then you say, see, we told you war was going to happen. And so what the way Abby and I talk about it in the conclusion of the book, we use this language of tripwires. These every time you intervene in complex systems, you can never just do one thing. And so you set up these tripwires that because everything is fragile, everything's entangled. So you intervene over here, then something else happens. It's analogous to like when you're a kid playing whack-a-mole, where you whack the mole over here and two more pop up over here, and the game is to try to get them all down. You can never get them all down. And that's kind of what happens. You intervene in one place to fight terrorism, you end up creating ISIS. Then you say, well, see, now there's terrorists in the world. Now we have to intervene here in order to combat ISIS. Then you say, okay, we're pulling back. But then you still have bases and military installations in Jordan. And then US troops in Jordan get attacked by drones. And then you see, now we have to go after Iran because this is their fault. And it's a never-ending cycle because of these tripwires. So these are all the do something fallacy. It's like we must continually do something in the name of freedom and protecting you, but doing something continually leads to the very thing you're trying to protect against. At least that's what you claim you're trying to protect against, which then justifies subsequent interventions. And so the very system, the way it's set up, is self-extending and self-enforcing. And so pick almost anything the national security state does, from domestic wartime production, which continues now. Again, we don't have a nationalized economy, but post World War II, the U.S. government adopted something that's oftentimes referred to as the permanent war economy, because during the Cold War, what happened is they said we can no longer sit back and wait for war to start and then ramp up. We need to continually prepare for war because we're fighting an ideology and we don't know what it's going to look like in the future. And so you got constant war preparations, constant production by the military sector. Then, of course, the rhetoric of military Keynesianism, which you still hear to this day. I've heard people justifying aid to Ukraine and elsewhere on the grounds of it creating jobs domestically. Again, what a miserable argument, both economically and just in terms of basic ethics. You know, you're going to, on the economic front, it's the simple but often neglected seen and unseen. The idea that creating jobs to make bombs means that those resources can't be used for other things, mainly for value added production. Uh, uh, the ethical argument being what a terrible way to justify military production. I'm creating jobs by creating tools of violence and harming other people. To my way of thinking, this is just horrible, both again in terms of economics, but also in terms of just the kind of moral rot that war making leads to amongst ordinary people, because all of a sudden they're making arguments to justify the whole network of activities involved in the endeavor. And so these are all examples, I think, and there's many, many more of once you unleash the genie from the bottle, the war making genie, it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to put back because it's just self justifying and self extending. And it requires a significant ideological shift, as well, probably as other factors, in order to try to bring it back down to earth and to hopefully put it in the bottle if that's possible.
And I feel like this is one of the things the national security elites knows about the seen and unseen. They just never talk about it. Zbigniew Brzezinski in 1979 gave Jimmy Carter a list of potential upsides to the U.S. if the Soviets do invade Afghanistan, one of them being they will have a Soviet Vietnam. Now, you might think, oh, the Soviets are going to go to war. That's really going to stimulate their economy and it's going to be great for them. But of course, behind closed doors, they're like, wars are going to bleed them dry just to decide who gets to sit on the throne in Afghanistan. So this is one I've just seen too many examples of how they talk about the Japanese overextending itself and eventually crumbling, the German Reich on two occasions overextending itself, Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia and that empire falling as a result, Tsar Nicholas going into the First World War and losing his empire. They know this one absolutely. Everything else I got to look a little more into. What was the War Revenue Act of 1917 and 1942, and how are these wars generally financed?
Sure. So earlier wars, including the world wars, there was a component that was paid by increasing taxes. So there was a concerted effort, which was transparent, to implement new taxes to finance part of the war. Of course, there was debt issuance as well. There was war bonds, and again, these war taxes were actually not unpopular because the U.S. government had done quite a good job convincing the American public that it was patriotic to engage in war making and to support the war. And of course, there was a huge propaganda effort behind this. For those unfamiliar, you can go look up the various propaganda posters about buying war bonds in order to support the troops, amongst a whole other set of economic acts, from rationing and not consuming things to not driving places and so on, all in the name of the public good and patriotism. But through time, what has happened is that the U.S. government has come to rely more and more on debt, on borrowing in order to finance wars. And certainly the wars associated with the war on terror, but other wars before that. Again, even when there was new taxes historically, debt issuance has always been part of this. But really, certainly post 9/11, debt issuance was almost used exclusively to finance the what's called the war on terror and all the activities involved. The Costs of War project that comes out of Brown University estimates, if I remember correctly, that the total cost of the war on terror is in the trillions. And I forget the exact number, but so we should fact check it. But I want to say it's something like 6, 7, or $8 trillion once you take into account monetary expenditures, veterans' health. So thank you, 8 trillion. So I was remembering it, and also interest on the debt, because we have to remember that debt payments come with interest. You have to service the debt, and this is enormously expensive. And you have to think to yourself, what was the return on investment for $8 trillion? Now, people might calculate that return differently, but my sense is you would be hard pressed even if you are a staunch advocate of U.S. military intervention abroad, to justify a return on $8 trillion that generated any kind of positive return.
And 900,000 deaths,
Yeah,
according to
of course.
this. I basically just got from your index, your citations at the end of the book. This is Brown University estimating 900,000 deaths as a causal result of, you know, what's his name? Zarqawi, Al Qaeda taking
Yep.
over after the fall of Saddam, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, after teaming up with them to fight against Bashar al Assad. The deaths that occurred after the fall of Muammar Gaddafi and the looting of the weapons in Libya. So that we all have to. I still appreciate Henry Hazlitt more and more as time goes on when he talks about the good economist doesn't just look at the immediate effects on one group, but on the longer effects on multiple groups. Such
Yep.
a valuable
Yeah.
lesson.
Hazlitt, Bastiat. I mean, very, very basic insight in some sense, but and it certainly doesn't answer all questions, but it gets you a long way once you internalize that lesson.
And another old economic lesson from Adam Smith talking about how when it comes to imperialism, it's not that the British or the Dutch people benefited, but some people benefited at the expense of others when it comes to colonialism or the Spanish Empire. You could say the same thing. When it comes to, all right, well, if these wars are so bad and they just cost a bunch of money and they kill a bunch of people and they have all these bad unintended consequences you and Abigail Hall say they have, then why has it been able to last for so long? Since the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, there have been wars. Why do they keep happening if they're all so bad?
Yeah, well, wars or violence is first of all part of life. So violence is always with us, no matter what, at a variety of scales. So that's number one. That goes to explain why they always happen. But then you have to say, well, why would a government undertake it if it wasn't in their interest? And certainly, I think it is in their interest. That's why they undertake it, or they believe it's in their interest. And then you have to say, well, what it's there, there's an important difference between the interest of those who control the levers of power and the broader populace. And I think one of the big mistakes that is made, again, partially because people refuse to think about it, perhaps, partially because the US government and other governments, all governments try to do this. They try to, from a very young age, say that there's almost a perfect alignment between government and the people. So the people are government, therefore, what government does is the people. And when you have that view, you don't have the full understanding of the realities of the situation, which is when you have deviations from that ideal, what it means is government, those that are running government, can do things that benefit some people at the expense of others. So this is just the logic of special interest groups, or if you're an economist or with an economics background, the idea of externalities. So we tend to think people always criticize markets for externalities. There's pollution and it's not internalized. Well, here's something. There's political externalities as well. What are political externalities? People in Washington, D.C. can do stuff. They can shift the costs off onto people in the Midwest, let's say, in the South, who have to foot the bill. Some living now, others unborn that will have to foot the bill. Go back to our $8 trillion discussion. Think about how many generations is going to be paying for that. But also, they can shift the costs onto people in other countries who are not part of the US political system. Those are all political externalities. And so, government is plagued by the fact that they can shift costs. The people in charge love it. The people that are in the private sector but are connected to that apparatus love it because they are able to feather their own nest at the expense of other people. That's what Adam Smith was getting at, by the way. The way he put it with the colonies is that the shopkeepers benefit. And he said the shopkeepers benefit because they get access to the markets that are colonized. But the ordinary people have to foot the bill for this endeavor, and it's enormously costly. And so his arguments against colonization were largely economic based. So they were based in terms of what today we'd call public finance and public choice type reasoning. And so that's why wars happen. Certainly it's in the interest of people. And again, Many people in international relations, I think, fall prey to this. Certainly policymakers do, but they talk about things like the national interest, the public interest, the global interest, as if this is something that exists, as if it's something that can be known. And it's a nice way to think about the world if you're running the world, because it leads to a very neat calculation. Oh, what I'm doing is for the national interest. And I can weigh what that looks like as if it's the equivalent of some kind of math problem. But the reality is that a very dramatically different view is that only people have interests. And this then turns to the institutions of government, because once you then start thinking about how government operates, you realize there's oftentimes a gap in between the interests of the ordinary people and those that are running the show. And once that gap exists, it creates enormous space for narrow opportunism, for small segments of the population who are in the in group. By the in group, I mean in government or connected to government, to benefit at the expense of others. And I personally think that is a very powerful explanatory mechanism for understanding much of how national security policy operates and evolves through time.
For more on this, you can check out my book, Domestic Imperialism. Chapter 4 is titled Government Failure. This was one of the main
Mhm.
reasons that I left progressivism. Quick word from Dennis Prager. I want to see how you respond to Mr. Prager. 29 seconds. He has one question for us.
Or what I asked at Oxford, and I asked, when in the history of the modern world has there been a conflict between a police state and a free state, and it was the free state that was the one that made the war? There's been no example of that. Wars are either between two police states or a police state and a free state. Two free states don't go to war. And whenever there is a free state and a police state at war, it's the police state that has made the war.
Whenever there is a free state and a police state, the police state has either always made the war, or at least in recent history has made the war come to fruition. Any counterexamples?
Well, I would think about the problem very differently, meaning that I think every state is a police state. I think there's different degrees of police states, but I think every single government has the potential to be a police state, and oftentimes is. And of course, the where we see states acting as police states. So if we take the dichotomy between free states and police states, as blunt as that short clip makes it sound, is it's a 0-1 type situation. You start looking at supposed free states when they go to war, they act a hell of a lot like police states. And if you want an example of this for viewers who are interested, go check out the Church Committee, which of course looked into U.S. surveillance after Seymour Hersh released the documents regarding the illegal operations by the CIA and others. And what the Church Committee said, and this is a government committee led by Frank Church, the senator at the time, was that in many ways the U.S. government was acting like an authoritarian regime. It was not acting like anyone would envision a democratic, constitutionally constrained republic to operate as. And that's what happens during war making. But let's go back for a moment and say only police states cause war. I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure, because I'm not so sure what the cause of war is in this case. My own understanding of wars throughout human history is that they are multifaceted in terms of their underlying causes. And oftentimes we only understand the full nuance of the various causes in hindsight, after we've had time to step back and analyze the situation, after we've had time to get access, to the extent we can get access, to government documents that talks about the war making, and so on. And so one way to define the world is good and evil, and then to say, well, only bad people start wars. But then how do you account for things like instances where the US government has been involved in places or pressured places or overthrown regimes in Latin America that have led to revolutions, and say, that's because of the police states. And so I think it's a very cheap way to explain and justify interventions, because notice it gives you a blank check. If only police states cause wars, then by definition, anything a free state does is not causing war and responding to what police states do. But war is a choice. War is a choice. And so war takes two to tango, at least two. Can be more than two, but it takes at least two sides to tango. And so is a cause of war a police state or a free state responding to that? Is the police state the initiator, or does the police state do things in response to the supposed free state doing things that they see as a threat? So International Relations 101, one of the things they highlight is the security dilemma. The idea that when one government does things in the name of making themselves safe, other governments are going to view that as a threat because now the side that has done stuff, accumulated weapons, whatever it is, has more weapons. So then they do things, they respond. And in general, I think it's a very poor way to argue by having simple dichotomies or by saying there's evil people in the world that do evil things. That's certainly true. There are evil people in the world that do evil things. And so by definition, that's true. But it's certainly not a way to explain wars and the various interactions and intricacies and the back and forth between them. And that's how I think about it. You would have to hold constant all their factors even to empirically test that. So I don't know how you would even go about doing that as a social scientific endeavor of any kind of validity. And so again, it sounds nice, but the way I view it is stack the deck in terms of getting the outcome you want to get because the way you have framed the problem situation.
Well, and it was Henry Asquith, British Prime Minister, who declared war against Germany in the First World War. Neville Chamberlain on September 3rd of 39 is the one who declared war against Germany. When it comes to the Gulf of Tonkin incident, Robert McNamara wrote a whole book called Argument Without End, where he met with the guys who were calling the shots in North Vietnam. He met them in 1995 to go over everything in, I think they met in Paris, or they might have met in Vietnam. And he said, look, unfortunately, there really wasn't an incident on August 4th of 1964 involving the U.S. Maddox in the Gulf of Tonkin. So those are some examples of free states declaring war on police states, not to mention, I'm sure he would consider Saddam and Gaddafi police state actors, and the U.S., who clearly initiated a war. Those governments started the wars in those cases. I just thought it was so ridiculous, and he says it with so much confidence.
Yeah, I think he again. I don't know what his response to your point would be. I imagine he would say this, which again I think is a very poor way to frame it and argue. He would say it's not the declaration of war that he's talking about; it's the need to go to war. So if those police states hadn't done whatever they did, we wouldn't need to respond. That's what I was saying earlier. It in some sense it automatically sets it up so that no matter what you do, you're right. Because if you declare war, it's because the other people did things they weren't supposed to do. If they declare war, it's because they did things they weren't supposed to do. So it's always the other side. It completely exonerates you of any responsibility or even need to justify your actions. You can just do what you need to do. And because there's bad people out there. And by the way, I think that logic, while I find it quite weak, just in terms of a argumentation and empirical way of framing the world, a way of framing empirical problems in the world. I think that's how a lot of people think. I think they think there's good and evil, U.S. good, everyone who's declared an enemy, which of course is a moving target in itself. Go back to Gaddafi, who at one point was viewed as an ally of the U.S. government until he wasn't. Then you can justify doing whatever you want to do. So it's a very nice way to sleep well at night, I imagine. But I think it's a very poor way to view the world. I think it's a very dangerous way to view the world.
Well, it's not easy to sleep well when you say, all right, yeah, we had to declare war to keep Danzig, which was 95% German. It had to stay in Polish hands. And then after millions of Polish deaths, they ended up with Soviet occupation for decades afterwards, right. The war for Polish independence. So, yep, I hope Mr. Prager's sleeping well. One last person I need you to respond to, because I wanted to give who I think are at least generally the best people. You mentioned Robert Kagan in the book. He was another potential steelman that came to mind. But here, I think this is getting to the heart of the matter. Here's William Buckley's case. I'll play what he said on Johnny Carson's show. He said, we should differentiate between first-degree murder and involuntary manslaughter. even though the same thing happens, an innocent person dies, the intentions of the actor still matter. It's 49 seconds. Here's how he summarized his position on Johnny Carson's show.
If you push an old lady and somebody else pushes an old lady, that which is similar between you and that other person is that you both push old ladies. Not whether you're pushing the old lady away from the way of a bus and the other fellow's pushing the old lady in the way
of the bus.
Yeah. And so I attempt in this novel, without surrendering the ambiguities, to make that distinction, that we're fighting on the right side, which has been, as you know, a terribly unfashionable thing to say. Although, as we know, Mr. Carter has now suffering from an inordinate fear of communism.
All right. You can't compare U.S. atrocities to other atrocities because U.S. atrocities were done with the right intentions. What do you say, Chris Coyne, author of How to Run Wars?
Yeah, well, I have a very different view, as you can imagine, which is you can say the atrocities are equal to one another, if not perhaps worse, which is a possibility. You can do worse atrocities in the name of responding to an atrocity. And so my own view on this is that human beings are human beings, meaning that he used the example of the grandmother and pushing the grandmother. If someone pushes a grandmother and then in retaliating, you push the grandmother, or you push over two grandmothers, or you kill the grandmother, then to my way of thinking, you're no better than the very people you are fighting, because the reason that you are justifying the fighting is because they pushed the grandmother. What a horrible thing to do. So I need to fight them, and I'm going to try my best. The claim is not to harm the grandmothers, but if I do, that's too bad. That's just war is hell kind of logic. And here's the thing: war making, certainly modern war making. The present, you can go back decades, certainly during the world wars, even before that. You're going to kill a large number of innocent people. You cannot avoid it. You can dress it up in whatever language you want. You can dress it up in drones or scalpels that only kill the bad guys. Whatever type of rhetoric you want, innocent people are going to be killed. So then you have to be able to make the argument that it is morally justified to kill innocent people in the name of killing protecting other innocent people, potentially protecting, I should say, other innocent people. And again, in other areas of life, think about how we think about these issues. If I just said to someone like, how many people do you think innocent people we can kill over here to save an innocent person over here? Those are tough philosophical issues, but most of the time people are repulsed by those type of questions, and rightfully so. And so with war making, here's what you're getting. I know I'm going to harm innocent people. All right. I don't know how many, but I'm going to harm innocent people. I'm getting at best uncertain benefits, meaning I might get no benefits. I might get costs. I might generate an outcome that is even worse than the status quo, which might be very bad, admittedly. And so that type of reasoning, again, like the Prager type reasoning, stacks the deck in your favor because you've predefined yourself as the good person, as the protector, which then means you are justified in harming innocent people. But isn't it a terrible thing to do to harm innocent people in general, which again is how we think about things in ordinary life? We view that as a terrible principle to act on. In terms of walking around, we don't think of trading off some human lives for others in our daily lives. Typically, most people respect other people, or at least I would hope that they would. And so, again, I find that quite a weak line of argumentation internally, but again, quite dangerous because you have set yourself up as standing on the moral high ground, which justifies any behavior you want, as long as you dress it up in the rhetoric of, well, we did our best to protect innocent people, which is why Abby and I in the book, the way we start one of the chapters, again, this is written to the national security elite. We say, look, to make an omelet, you have to crack some eggs. And the eggs here are human lives and innocent people. And so not the greatest thing, but that's what it takes. So you got to embrace it. And that's what war making entails. And we should fully embrace that and recognize what it means for us as human beings and as moral beings, because all of these exercises are almost always justified. And when I say exercise, I mean war making, in terms of the moral high ground: liberty, liberalism, freedom, respecting human beings. But war making as an exercise itself is the antithesis of that. It is not respecting people. It is not respecting individualism, dignity, and so on down the line. And so you have to ask yourself, at what point do we become the very thing we purport to be fighting against? And in my own view, we become that very thing very quickly once you engage in war making activities.
Excellent points. Yeah, when it comes to dehumanization, there is a senator, Seth Moulton, who was talking about Taiwan and China, and he said the U.S. should make it very clear to China that if you invade Taiwan, we're going to blow up TSMC, which, by the way, is the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. In other words, they're going to destroy trillions of dollars in wealth if the Chinese potentially install a favorable regime in Taiwan or threaten to blockade it. And also, we trade so much with China itself. Why wouldn't we just keep trading with them, even if, worst case scenario, Xi assassinated the Taiwanese president and installed his puppet? We trade so much with them anyways. Why couldn't we just keep trading? So, with that amount of psychopathy out there, I always ask people, when would another country be justified in blockading America, then bombing American cities, then assassinating American politicians and installing friendlier politicians? And the response you get on their faces, "How dare you even mention this? I can't believe you probably don't even stand for the national anthem. You're a terrible person." But it at least plants some seed when it comes to actually either changing public opinion potentially or drastically increasing the amount of insecurity they feel when they're pushing mass murder of people in China, mass murder of people in North Korea, mass murder of Iranians, mass murder of Russians. Lindsey Graham came out and said, Russians are dying, and that's a good thing. This is the best money we've ever spent. It's a great investment.
That's right.
Psychotic. So, when it comes to quick bullet points that you could give to the average person, which might flick this switch that gets them to see things consistently, anything come to mind as far as quick sales pitches?
Sure. Think about your least favorite politician and government program. And that can be a current political official or someone in history. But just think about the person, and you can combine people, the least desirable features. And then think about if you would want that person or that government program to have control over the most powerful military and surveillance apparatus in the world and in human history. And if that causes you concern, then think through what the implications are, which is once you have established this apparatus, which exists now, at some point, that least favorable politician is going to come to control it, whether it's an elected official, a bureaucrat, or some combination thereof. And think through what the implications are of that. And once you think in terms of those implications, it gets you out of the mindset of I'm a Republican, a Democrat, or whatever you are, and step back and think about the nature of the state and the nature of state operations as it relates to national security.
Like I said, this book is just terrific. It's nice, short, and to the point. You learn something on every single page, stuff we didn't even get to. You will learn about Alien and Sedition Acts, COINTELPRO, lessons from Libya on page 125. You'll learn something I learned. There is someone named Reality L. Winner. Is that the name of the whistleblower? I had not heard of this alleged whistleblower before. I don't know if whatever she leaked was accurate or anything, but it's an important lesson in how the Espionage Act operates today, even under President Trump. So I absolutely recommend the book. Dr. Coyne, thank you so much for your time, sir.
Thank you, Keith. I always appreciate it.